This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hello, folks. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 62. We will be jumping in with a question from Javier from Argentina/Spain, who says, what are the functions in non-human great apes of their corresponding areas to our Broca's and Wernicke's?
Well, this takes us back 3 episodes, where you might recall we were talking about a question about how is a second language wired in the brain? Is it wired differently than your primary one? What's up with the neurobiology of bilingualism? And in the process, we had sort of a quick tour of the neurobiology of language, which is going to become very relevant now to Javier's question. We had 2 brain areas that were emphasized, as he noted: Wernicke's cortex, Wernicke's area, an area of the cortex which is close to the auditory cortex, where language comprehension is happening. And we have Broca's area, which is close to your motor cortex, which has to do with language production. Now, a key thing that we talked about then is lateralization of brain function, which is to say that Broca's and Wernicke's, the parts that are most responsible for language, are not found in both hemispheres. Instead, they're lateralized, and in 90% of people or so, it's lateralized to the left hemisphere. And what dogma used to be was all of language is in the left hemisphere, and who knows what's going on the right there. It's just empty real estate. And what people eventually realized is the equivalent areas in the right hemisphere are doing interesting things like prosody, where tone of voice imparts meaning. But nonetheless, in most people, 90% of people or so, language is most centered in Wernicke's and Broca's on the left side of the brain. And the way to appreciate that is when you look at the thickness of Wernicke's and Broca's on the left side versus on the right side, there's an asymmetry. It's thicker in the left side in us, reflecting its more central role in language comprehension and language production. So that brings us to the question of, like, chimp brains, gorilla brains, they're very similar to ours. Do they have an equivalent of Broca's and Wernicke's in terms of like stuff sitting just near the auditory cortex or just below the motor cortex? And yes, absolutely they do. And thus the question being, what are they doing there? And this whole subject was sort of blown open, I don't know, 2001 or so. Wonderful work by a guy named William Hopkins, MD Anderson Cancer Center, University of Texas, looking at the brains of chimps and gorillas. And in a science paper at the time reporting something remarkable, the Wernicke's and Broca's cortical areas, the equivalents in a chimp and gorilla, are thicker on the left side than on the right, just like in humans, just like this is an area that is specialized for language. So asymmetry there, not as much of one as you find in humans, but this was remarkable. And then what subsequent studies did was look at brain areas that are in much more detail, looking at jargon in the field, cytoarchitecture, the shape, the structure of the individual neurons in there. And you see in the human Wernicke and Broca's areas this very characteristic ordering of neurons in a way that's called mini columns. And you see something just like that in gorillas and chimps. Whoa, we've been separated from them for half a dozen million years, but it seems like our last common ancestor already had the starts of this side of the brain, these 2 areas, getting specialized for something fancy down the line. And then the field got expanded even further by the demonstration that you see left lateralized asymmetry in the equivalence of Broca's and Wernicke's in monkeys and rhesus monkeys as well, which now takes us back 20 million years to the last common ancestor we and the other apes and the monkeys all had. So this is very, very old. So the question becomes, what's it for? Humans thickest, other apes thinner, monkeys even thinner, but nonetheless still thicker than on the other side. Something special going on here. And there's been a handful of studies since then suggesting that in another primate species, these areas are sort of doing a proto version, a rudimentary version of what they're doing in us. One study, for example, and this was looking at functional brain imaging. You put somebody in a brain scanner and you play a bunch of random sounds to them, and the auditory cortex activates. And now instead, they listen to someone speaking, and the auditory cortex activates, as well as the Wernicke's. It is comprehending the language. You take a rhesus monkey and do the same thing, and you play just random noises, and auditory cortex activates, and play the vocalizations of other rhesus monkeys, and now Wernicke's activates as well. This area that is specialized for the sound of vocalization from your own species. So that's pretty remarkable in terms of the similarity there. Then a follow-up study, again with rhesus monkeys, looking at sort of the building blocks of syntax, the fact that, dog bites man and man bites dog means different things, the ordering. And this is one where people have to be paying attention to the ordering of random syllable sounds and focusing for which ones they've heard before, as is the rhesus monkey. And what you see is when we're doing that task, following very rough rudimentary laws there of syntax, we activate Wernicke's area. And what they saw in this study was you're doing the same thing if you're a rhesus monkey. This part of the brain that's paying attention to vocalizations from your species as opposed to just random sound and is attuned to things like ordering of sounds, proto syntax. It's the same part of the brain, which is structurally bearing a lot of similarities. Okay, so what that's suggesting is other primate species are doing much fancier stuff than people used to think in terms of language communicatory stuff. And the neurobiological underpinnings of it have a lot in common, seem to be just more rudimentary versions of the same asymmetry. That said, you see another type of asymmetry in the brains of other primates, which is parts of our motor cortex controlling our hands are thicker on one side than the other. That's how you wind up being a righty or a lefty. There's cortical asymmetry there, and you see handedness in other primates as well. In humans, 90% wind up being right-handed. I'm a lefty. What you see in other apes and monkeys, it's about 60, 70% are right-handed. So we've got this precedent for asymmetry, one side of the brain being more adept at stuff than the equivalent in the other side. And it's whether it's fine motor control in monkeys or comprehending vocalizations, keeping track of ordering of sounds, proto-syntax. Okay, so we're once again up with, whoa, other primates are doing fancy stuff. Then last month, there was a paper in Science that like blew this whole issue further open, having to do with bonobos. Bonobos, the relatives of chimps, they share as much DNA with us as chimps do. Bonobos are amazing. And what this paper was about was arguing that bonobos have a very specialized feature of human language, which is called compositionality. Compositionality, what's that? There's boring versions, but the version that's fancy in humans is as follows. You say the word wallaby. You say the word top hat. They each have a meaning. And now you say wallaby top hat. And it still is sort of referring to a wallaby and a top hat. On the other hand, non-trivial compositionality in action here now, you say the word horse, and that's talking about Rin Tin Tin or whoever the horse's name was, and you say the word shoe, and it's something, and you combine them and you say horseshoe, and it is something very different from both a horse and a shoe. This is compositionality going in, and it could become multi-layered compositionality. Chest, you show somebody a picture of a chest overflowing with doubloons and treasures, and you say, what is that? And they say, oh, that's a chest. And then you show them a picture of an acorn, and you say, what is that? And they say, that's a nut. And then you show them a picture of a chestnut, and you say, what is that? It's a chestnut. You have just done compositionality on that, although a chestnut is a subset of nut. But you could take it one step further, which is the idiomatic use of the word chestnut, which is, oh my God, if they're going to sit again and tell the same story about how when they were a kid, they chopped down the cherry tree and their dad caught them and they were tempted to lie, but they told the truth. I have heard that a zillion times. I can't believe they're going to tell that old chestnut again. An idiom in English, where that bears no resemblance to nuts or chests or get your chestnuts out of the fire. So compositionality. So what they argue in this paper is they're seeing evidence for the same in bonobos. What circumstances, what contexts provoke this type of vocalization from a bonobo, provoke that type, and you begin to see something akin to the meaning of this particular vocalization. And one of them meant, I would like that. I would like that piece of food. I would like that always is associated with something tempting appearing. And bonobos make this sound. It's called a peep sound. And you can hear it if you look up the paper on the supplementary information. Okay, so that means something like that. Then there's a different sound that they make, which by looking at context and all of that, it's something about let's all stay together. And what they then noted was sometimes the peep sound, the I would like to, followed by the other sound, us stay together, would be linked in a very different context when the bonobo was being sexually solicited. I would like for us to stay together here. Compositionality. So the argument was that they were detecting a number of cases of that with bonobos. Whoa, that is so much more complicated. Who ever thought another species could do this? So this blew everyone away. And in trying to read the paper, part of what blew everyone away, or at least me, was some incredibly fancy analytical techniques that they used in the paper that's used in human linguistics of like five-dimensional spaces, and I have no idea what it is I just said, and I couldn't understand that part of the paper. And what the rest of the field seems to be saying is, whoa, that is really, really, really cool, but I don't really understand the techniques that they used. This was the first time this has been applied to another species. So this is cool. Let's not get too excited yet. Let's see if this holds up. But this is, at least at this moment, like the flashiest outpost of what other primates are doing with their asymmetrically thickened Wernicke's area, Broca's area, 20 million years in the making of this part of the brain having something to do with communicatory comprehension and production, and not just in humans.
All right, next, Saeed from Iraq says, can you talk about the developmental origin of health and disease hypothesis and your opinion of it?
I think it is very solid and very interesting science. Okay, we start with a human situation. And, often in science, when you look at a finding, it was first demonstrated in lab rats and perhaps then in monkeys and finally in humans. This began in humans in the winter of 1944 in Holland. Holland, occupied by the Nazis at the time, and an uprising began. And as punishment, the Nazis diverted all of the food in the Netherlands to Germany for that winter. 3 months, what is now known historically as the Dutch hunger winter. Complete starvation, 20, 30,000 people starved to death. Then Holland was liberated by the Allies, food returned, the hunger winter was over with, and what was left was a very interesting observation. And what prompted someone to look at this, who knows? But if you were a fetus, a first or second trimester fetus during the Dutch hunger winter, 60 years later, when you were a 60-year-old, you had a greatly increased risk of adult onset diabetes, obesity, metabolic syndrome, hypertension, like major increase. Some of the initial measures suggesting almost a 20-fold increase. So something about having been a fetus first or second trimester. What are the control groups? People who were third trimester fetuses at the time. Look 60 years later, people who had just been born, people who were conceived just afterward, something about this window. So we have this Dutch hunger winter phenomenon that, having been exposed to the severe starvation somewhere in those first two trimesters, and years, decades later, your body's metabolism is working differently, and you are far more subject to a bunch of metabolic diseases. So this was something that was first really identified an English physician named David Barker, who expanded on this into his hypothesis of the fetal origins of adult disease, FOAD, fetal origins, that all sorts of fetal events can affect health outcomes half a century later. And the concept that came in at the time was that all sorts of metabolic programming, imprinting, is occurring during fetal life about how the system is going to work forever after. Okay, so since then, what people have figured out, there's at least 3 additional fascinating things about the Dutch hunger winter. First thing is, this isn't the only time it's happened. And people since then have documented in the 1950s in China during the Great Leap Forward agricultural disasters that caused massive famine. There was a similar phenomenon for people who were first or second trimester fetuses. Many years later, increased metabolic risk, people who were fetuses during the siege of Leningrad during World War II. So this is a phenomenon that has been observed elsewhere. The next interesting thing is it's not only about increased vulnerability to metabolic diseases. It turns out in all of these settings, having been a fetus during this starvation thing increases your risk of schizophrenia. In that case, it happens to be if you had been a third trimester fetus during that. So other diseases, if you were a fetus while your mother was clinically depressed, well into adulthood, you have an increased risk of depression after controlling for if your mother continued to be depressed after you were born. So a whole bunch of diseases are made more likely as a result of fetal adversity. The third thing on the expansion is, obviously, no surprise, it's not just fetal life, it's early postnatal environment as well, where events, adverse events, lousy physiological luck, and years, decades later, that has increased the likelihood of certain diseases. And as phrased in the question, expanding from just fetal life, now looking at the developmental origins of adult health and disease. And that has now been shown in a whole bunch of domains, and the amount of inflammation you were exposed to in childhood is one of the pacemakers of brain aging 3/4 of a century later. Okay, so what's going on in this? First off, what's the mechanistic basis by which, having been starving as a fetus early in the gestation period, sets you up 60 years for these metabolic diseases? And what people realized is what this does, starvation as a fetus during this period when you are metabolically imprinting, programming your metabolism, is you develop what was termed a thrifty metabolism. Your body gets incredibly good at storing away every calorie of food that hits the circulation, storing it away such that with a normal Western diet now for the subsequent 60 years, you're more likely to be obese and hypertension and metabolic syndrome and diabetes. Your metabolism has become thrifty. It's much better at grabbing every available nutrient in the bloodstream and storing it away. What people then figured out was, what's the actual mechanism for this? And this is this concept we've gone at a bunch of times of epigenetics. The environment experience does not change your genes, does not change your DNA sequences. What it does instead is change the regulation of your genes, how readily they are turned on or off in different circumstances in different parts of your body. And what people soon figured out was Dutch hunger winter fetuses had a lifelong epigenetic change in the insulin growth factor receptor. Okay, all we need to focus on here is insulin has something to do with energy storage. This was the mechanism for it. So be a starving fetus early on. Your body metabolically imprints, thanks to an epigenetic effect on these metabolism associated genes, because a bunch of them have been identified now, so that you now have a thrifty metabolism. You are really good at absorbing potential calories out of the circulation and storing it away, and thus off you go towards diabetes and obesity. That has an interesting implication. So, suppose you are a Dutch hunger winter fetus and you've got this thrifty metabolism now, and 30 years later, you're pregnant. You're pregnant and you're having a normal diet now. And because of your thrifty metabolism, you are taking a disproportionate share of the nutrients that get into your bloodstream. You're absorbing a disproportionate share of them, meaning that your fetus is getting somewhat calorically deprived and thus is born with a mild version of a Dutch hunger winter effect, so that they have a somewhat more thrifty metabolism 30 years later when they're pregnant, so that their fetus has a milder version. And what you have is multi-generational transmission of this trait. Okay, so now we know how having been a starving fetus sets you up, potentially your children, your grandchildren, for having a body that's better at storing nutrients and thus putting you more at risk for all sorts of metabolic diseases of Western lifestyle. What is this about? Why does it work this way? And we have two very contrasting schools as to how to think about Dutch hunger winter, fetal origins of adult disease, the broader concept of developmental origins of health and disease. One way to think about it is one in the world of medicine and the world of disease. This is a bad thing. This is a bad thing. This sets you up for all sorts of diseases later in life. Early life adversity, metabolic adversity, inflammatory adversity, early life, fetal life, or soon after birth, early life adversity is still leaving scars 60, 70 years later in terms of increased disease risk. This phenomenon is pathogenic. This is the world of disease. But then you pull in the evolutionary biologists and naturalists, and you get a very different interpretation. So, you're a Dutch hunger winter fetus, and in a normal animal a million years ago, whatever, and you are not getting a whole lot of food. What is your body learning? There's not a whole lot of nutrition out there. I better have a really efficient metabolism forever after, because my nutritional disaster while I'm being a fetus is a good predictor of what it's going to be like afterward. And in that regard, the metabolic program, the epigenetics, the thrifty metabolism is great. And it's great in a way that people now refer to as a preparative adaptive response, a PAR. So the question becomes whether something like this early in life represents a scar of disease or a par of pre-adaptation, patent pending. What you've got then is this question of when is this a good thing and when is it a bad thing? And what's clear is in a natural world, it depends on two variables. One is how long do these epigenetic effects last? Is this something that is now going to be relevant for your childhood, relevant the rest of your life? How persistent on it? Because epigenetic effects are long lasting, but very often they're not permanent. Second question, how good is your early life environmental traumas? How good of a predictor is it accurately that there's going to be more of this stuff later? If it is a good predictor, yes, this is perfect. This is a preparative adaptation for what the outside world is going to be like when you get born, and that could be highly adaptive. So there's two very different schools of thought with it. This is the world of medicine, disease, pathology, a scar of early life adversity. This is the world of an evolutionarily clever thing to do, preparative adaptation for early life being a predictor of what your subsequent life is going to be like. What is clear is the Dutch hunger winter is a disease scar scenario. Dutch hunger winter or in Leningrad or in China, because in those it turned out the starvation during your fetal life wasn't an accurate predictor of what nutrition was going to be like forever after. And the Dutch example is the clearest one. Food was okay. Germans shut off all food access, complete depletion. And after liberation, food comes back a square wave, and then you resume a westernized lifestyle diet forever after. In the case of the Dutch hunger winter effect, that one is not preparative because it turned out this was a very unique circumstance.
So we will wrap up with a related question from Mohammed from Tunisia, who asks, can you do the Palestinian version of the Dutch hunger winter?
Unfortunately, yes. Okay, October 7th, Hamas's attack on Israel. Since then, Israel's something approximating total war on the population of Gaza. And soon after the start of it, an issue became food shortages in Gaza. And that generated all sorts of political tussling. Why wasn't enough food getting to civilians in Gaza? One interpretation coming from Israel, the United States, Hamas was intercepting food convoys, hijacking the food, keeping it for themselves, selling it for a profit. A Palestinian interpretation being the documented cases of West Bank settlers attacking convoys, blocking them. Who was more responsible for this? All sorts of confusion. And then it all became moot about 2 months ago on March 2nd, when this issue of not enough food convoys coming through was settled by Israel cutting off all food and water and electricity to Gaza. And since then, we have had the population there starving. Now, this, of course, generates a lot of controversy, as with everything related to this. Ooh, are they really starving? And there's been this sort of cynical skepticism that has been happening since the beginning of the war, when there would be an Israeli bombing and we would find out how many people were killed. Who's telling us? The Palestinian Health Ministry, run by Hamas, obviously exaggerating the numbers. They can't be trusted. What we have here now, the whole notion that there's no food there anymore, comes from sources we can believe, coming from Americans. For example, the World Food Kitchen, which is a US run operation, shut down all of their food kitchens last week because they got no more food. The U.S. American Near East Refugee Aid Program has shut down for lack of food. UN World Food Program, likewise, American branch of UNICEF, they have no food. There is no food. There is no question that this is complete starvation going on there. And in terms of consequences, what is also equally clear, we can believe it because these are outside authorities telling us, from the World Health Organization and from Save the Children, a British organization, both of them documenting that over the last 6 months or so, it's been an average of about 10,000 children per month showing up with malnutrition at these field clinics, except since March 2nd, with this complete cutoff of food, the rate of malnutrition has approximately doubled. Okay, so pretty clearly, this is like a textbook example of you're going to see a Dutch hunger winter effect on these kids, on fetuses and pregnant women. And yeah, whoa, 50 years from now, the history books can say, we now have 4 examples. We got the Dutch hunger winter, we got the siege of Leningrad, we got the famine in China, and we've got the siege of Gaza in 2025. Yeah. So that's one conclusion one can reach. Another conclusion is, yeah, these are now going to be kids who are going to be more at risk for metabolic diseases 50, 60 years from now. And all things considered, who cares? Because the state of things right now are these are kids with a very elevated risk of dying from starvation. dying from Israeli bombing, dying from some easily treated infectious disease because the whole medical care infrastructure in Gaza has been destroyed. Basically, like these kids are going to be lucky to come out the other end. Here's would be like a best case scenario. You've got a little boy in Gaza right now who is starving and makes it through the other end, and 60, 70 years from now, he's sitting outdoors at a big dinner table with his family. And he's an old guy. He's not very healthy. He's got diabetes. He's got high blood pressure. His son says, "Don't forget, you got the cardiologist appointment on Tuesday. Remember, I'll come and pick you up." The grandkids tease grandpa because they caught him earlier sneaking some baklava or halava, some dessert. "Ooh, grandpa's not supposed to eat treats and stuff because of his diabetes," and they're all teasing him, and they're sitting there in their own free, safe country having an interaction like this. This counts as the best that could be hoped for now. It is a pretty bad situation if living long enough to eventually be a victim of the developmental origins of disease winds up being that your fortune that you can have that as a 60-year-old. That's how bad things are there right now.
And that is where we will end episode 62. Keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Chair Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.